Recently, our presidential anchor Rob Edwards had an exclusive interview with Republican vice presidential candidate Dick Cheney. Well, Rob, throughout the evening, we're going to be showing our viewers some portions of that interview.
That's right, Ashley. During our interview, we talked about education. My first question was on the subject of school vouchers.
It's important to understand what we're talking about in terms of the thrust of our policy focuses on the federal funds. And federal funds constitute 6 or 7% of the total budget. And we do have a proposal there that if after a period of years a school is not performing, that we would then take the federal funds that are flowing to that school, recommend taking them away and giving them to the parents. And the parents would decide then what they wanted to do with them. They could hire a tutor or go out and send their kids to another public school or to a private school. It would be their choice what they did with it. That does not affect the bulk of funding, which is provided at the state and local level, 94% of the money that's provided here in Tennessee, obviously by the state of Tennessee and local school districts. And there are various proposals around the country. Michigan has a referendum this year, also California, on this issue of whether or not that money, state and local money, ought to be distributed under a voucher system. We haven't taken a position on those issues. That is, the question of vouchers for the bulk of the funding really is an issue we think ought to be decided at the state and local level, not by the federal government.
Once again, we're going to Rob Edwards to hear some excerpts from his interview with Republican vice presidential candidate Dick Cheney.
That's right, Ashley. Another question I asked Secretary Cheney was about school accountability.
Well, what we'd like to do, there are some 60 different federal grant and aid programs now oriented towards education. We'd like to collapse those into 5 programs and then give that money out to the states, but with fewer strings attached than ever before. They'd have more flexibility over how they spend the money, what they decide to spend it on. We wouldn't say you have to hire teachers or you have to build new classrooms. That's a decision that really needs to be made at the local level. What we would say is that in return for the flexibility we want to provide in terms of funding, we want you to do 2 things. We want you to set standards. State ought to set the standards, not the federal government. And secondly, we want to make sure you have a system of accountability. You can design it, put it together however you want, but we think it does involve testing on a regular basis, that if you don't test every child every year, you can't know whether or not you're making progress. And that's key to accountability. Al Gore talks about accountability, but he does not provide for regular testing of every child. So in effect, in return for more flexibility on how you spend the federal money, we would ask the states to establish standards and then make sure that you have a system of accountability for how that money's spent. We don't want the funds just to continue to be spent on failing schools.
We're heading over once again to Rob Edwards, who will introduce another portion of his interview with Dick Cheney.
That's right, Ashley. I asked Secretary Cheney his opinion on smaller class sizes.
We think that's a decision's got to be made at the local level. The fact is there is not necessarily any relationship between class size and how kids perform. There are a lot of places around the world where there are large classes and the kids still do very well. So, but again, that issue of how many teachers you have, how many classrooms you have, how many students you have per teacher, we don't think the federal government ought to be dictating to school systems on that basis. We think those are decisions that people at the local level are perfectly capable of making. If they want to spend more money on teachers, that's fine. They may want to spend it on teacher training. We do have some areas where we want to make a special focus. For example, Head Start, we'd like to reorient and give it more academic content, put it into the Department of Education. We'd like to commit $5 billion, federal dollars, to reading, to making certain every child can read by the 3rd grade. So there are things like that that we want to separate out and support. But the question of class size specifically is an input, if you will, and what we're interested in are results. And we want to trust people at the local level here in Germantown or in Tennessee to make those decisions about what they best need in order to advance their kids' education. We think if they have high standards and accountability, then they'll begin to make good decisions, but they know what's best in terms of what their local requirements and needs are.
Well, let's check in with Rob Edwards once again to hear more of his exclusive interview with Republican vice presidential candidate Dick Cheney.
Thanks, Ashley. Another question I asked Secretary Cheney was if he would support a bill giving federal money to help rebuild American schools. Here's what he had to say.
We support, in particular, a change that would allow new bonding authority at the local level in terms of for the construction of school facilities. We think this is an appropriate way to go. Schools currently have not been eligible for that kind of thing in the past. We would change the law so they would be in the future. That would allow, we think, significant expansion in terms of the construction program for those districts that wanted to undertake that kind of program.
I just want to ask, in such a tight race, why did you choose to address students here at Germantown High School who aren't even, some of them aren't even old enough to vote? Why did you choose to come here?
Some of them are old enough to vote or will soon be. But schools are important, and we had a lot of parents in the audience today, as well as folks from around the local community. Schools are very important, and getting young people engaged in the political process is very important. And it was certainly one of the highlights of my career were the opportunities I've had as a result of having the opportunity to participate politically when I was a youngster. It changed my life, and I think the future of the country depends in part upon getting young people to recognize how enormous privileged we are to be Americans, and the obligation that all of us have as a result of that to make certain the system does work, that we do get out there and get active in the community and active in supporting, especially in national elections.